The sea is black, not blue, not gray. Black, the way water looks in the hour before the sun decides to rise. A small wooden boat drifts across it, and inside that boat sits a man with a long knife of a face and eyes that don't blink very often. He isn't rowing anymore, he's carving. In his hands is an oar, a plain, waterlogged boat oar, and with a short knife he is shaving it down, stroke by stroke, into the long curved shape of a sword. He should have arrived hours ago. Somewhere on the shore ahead of him, on a thin strip of sand on an island so small it barely has a name yet, another man has been waiting since dawn. That man is furious. That man is, by every account history has kept of him, the finest swordsman most people in Japan have ever seen, a warrior so feared they call him the Demon. The Demon has a real sword, a masterwork of folded steel, longer than almost any blade carried by a single warrior in the entire country. The man in the boat has a piece of wood he is still shaving into shape. He does not row faster. He does not seem afraid. He glances at the sky instead, watching where the sun will rise, and adjusts his direction very slightly, not toward the island's dock, but toward a spot on the beach, where in about an hour the morning light will land exactly behind his own shoulders and directly into his enemy's eyes. Somewhere behind him, his oarsman mutters that the other man is going to be very, very angry. The man carving the sword doesn't look up. Let him be angry, he says. Anger is not a technique. We will come back to this beach. We will come back to this morning, and to the two men on it, and to the single blow that is about to decide which one of them walks away. But first, we have to go back much further than that, to a small cold house in the mountains of Japan, more than 25 years earlier, where a baby was about to be born, into a story that would end here, on this beach, at dawn. To introduction, a country at the edge of peace. Picture Japan in the year 1584. Not the Japan you might imagine from movies with bullet trains and bright neon signs. A much older Japan. A country stitched together out of dozens of separate territories, each one ruled by its own warlord, called a daimyo. For over 100 years, these warlords had been fighting each other in a long, grinding conflict historians call the Sengoku period, the age of the country at war. If you had been born in Japan in 1584, war wouldn't have felt like a chapter in a history book. It would have felt like weather. It was just there. Something that had always been happening, and something everyone quietly expected would keep happening for the rest of their life. But something was changing. A handful of extraordinarily powerful warlords, men with names like Oda Nobunaga and soon Tokugawa Ieyasu, were slowly forcing all those smaller territories to bend to a single will. Japan was being pulled, piece by piece, toward unification. Nobody alive in 1584 knew it yet, but the endless war was entering its final act. This is the world our story begins in. A warrior class called samurai lived by a strict code of loyalty, discipline, and honor, serving their daimyo in exchange for land, income, and status. Swords were not decorations. They were tools of survival, carried by men who might have to use them at any hour of any day. And in a quiet, mountainous province called Harima, on the western side of the main island of Honshu, a woman was about to give birth to a son. Nobody at that birth could have known they were looking at the boy who would one day be called the greatest swordsman Japan had ever produced. Nobody could have known that this same boy, before he ever picked up a proper sword, would already be carrying a wound so old that it happened on the very first day of his life. Let's go back there now, to the beginning. Every historian who studies Miyamoto Musashi will tell you the same thing right up front, so let's be honest about it together. Some of the details of his birth are genuinely disputed. Even the province is argued over. Most traditional accounts place his birth in the spring of 1584 in the village of Miyamoto in Harima province, but other equally old records claim he was actually born in the neighboring province of Mimasaka. Historians still don't agree. We're not going to pretend that debate is settled, because pretending would mean lying to you. And this is a story that deserves the truth, even when the truth is a little blurry. What we do know is this. The baby born that spring was not named Musashi. Not yet. His parents named him Benosuke. And almost immediately, his life took its first painful turn. His mother died, by most traditional accounts, in childbirth or in the very short time afterward. Benosuke would grow up with no memory of her voice, her face, or her hands. Think about that for a second. Everyone else you will ever meet in your life has some connection to the person who gave birth to them, even if it's just a story someone told them. Benosuke didn't even have that. He had an absence where a mother should have been. In Japan at this time, losing a parent in infancy was tragically common. Disease, difficult childbirth, and constant warfare meant that childhood itself was dangerous. But that doesn't make loss any less painful for the person living through it. It just meant Benosuke wasn't alone in his grief, even if it never felt that way to him. There is a particular kind of loneliness in growing up with a hole where a parent should be, and Benosuke's story only gets heavier from here, because the parent who did survive, his father, would turn out to be almost as hard to reach as the mother he never knew. Benosuke's father was not an ordinary man. He was, by the standards of his era, something close to a legend, and legends, it turns out, do not always make gentle fathers. His name was Shinmen Munisai, and if you had asked anyone in Harima province who the finest swordsman in the region was, more than a few of them would have said his name without hesitating. Munisai fought with two very different weapons, the sword and a shorter, blunt iron weapon called a jite, a kind of metal truncheon with a hook near the handle, designed to catch and twist an opponent's blade right out of their hands. Using a sword and a jite together at the same time was unusual. Munisai had built his entire fighting style around that unusual combination, and it made him dangerous in a way most swordsmen simply weren't prepared for. Tradition holds that Munisai was honored by the shogun's court itself with the title Hyoho Shoko, meaning something close to unrivaled in strategy. Whether or not the title was granted in exactly the ceremony later chroniclers described, the reputation behind it was real. People across the region knew the name Shinmen Munisai, and they said it carefully. You'd think being raised by a swordsman that skilled would mean an idyllic childhood of careful training and warm encouragement. It didn't. Munisai and his son did not get along. The relationship between them was cold, and at times openly hostile. We don't know every detail of why. Grief does strange things to people, and a wife's death can curdle into something dark and misplaced if a man doesn't know where else to put it. What we do know is that young Benosuke grew up in a household where warmth was in short supply, and where the one person who might have taught him tenderness instead taught him mostly to be tough. There's something worth sitting with here, something almost any kid watching this can understand in their bones. The ache of feeling like you can't quite reach a parent's approval, no matter what you do. That ache doesn't disappear just because you grow up to be one of history's greatest warriors. If anything, Musashi spent the rest of his life still circling that same question, am I enough? Even after he had nothing left to prove to anyone. Eventually, whether through the strain of a broken home or a family decision we no longer have clear records of, young Benosuke left his father's house. He didn't end up in the streets, though. He ended up somewhere far more surprising, in the quiet halls of a Buddhist temple, under the care of a man who would give him something his father never could. That man was his uncle, and what he taught Benosuke would shape him just as much as any sword ever would.
His uncle's name was Dorinbo, a Buddhist priest, a man devoted to a life of stillness, study, and spiritual discipline, about as different from Shinmen Munisai as it's possible to be. Under Dorinbo's roof, young Benosuke learned things that had nothing to do with swords. He learned to read. He learned to write with a brush, forming characters carefully on paper, a skill called calligraphy, which was considered its own art form in Japan, every bit as demanding as swordsmanship. He learned to sit still and meditate, to quiet the noise in his own head, to breathe. Here's the thing, though, and it's important because it's the first real crack in who Musashi was going to become. Even surrounded by candles and quiet chanting and the smell of incense drifting through temple halls, some deeper hunger in Benosuke never went away. He wanted to fight, not out of cruelty, out of something closer to curiosity, and a fierce, burning need to know exactly how strong he really was. Think of it like this. Imagine someone hands you a quiet, peaceful hobby, say painting or reading, and it's lovely, and you're grateful for it. But there's this other thing calling to you at the same time. Something loud and urgent that you can't quite explain. And you don't know yet whether it's going to save you or destroy you. That was Benosuke at 11, 12 years old. Torn between two entirely different paths, the priest's path of peace and the warrior's path of the blade, while still being just a kid trying to figure out who he was. Dorinbo's temple education gave Musashi something almost none of the sword-obsessed warriors of his era had: genuine literacy and artistic training at a young age. Decades later, this same boy would become one of Japan's most respected ink-wash painters and calligraphers. The peaceful uncle's lessons never left him. They just went quiet for a very long time. But peace, it turned out, wasn't going to win this argument. Not yet. Because one day, when Benosuke was just 13 years old, he saw a notice posted in a nearby town, an open challenge from a wandering swordsman looking for a fight. And something in him said, "That's mine." What happened next would end a man's life, launch a legend, and set a course that Benosuke, soon to be known by an entirely different 13 years old and already a killer. Let's slow down here because this moment matters, and it deserves to be told carefully rather than rushed through. The wandering swordsman's name was Arima Kihei, and he belonged to a respected fencing tradition called the Kashima Shinto school. Arima was doing something fairly common at the time, traveling from town to town, posting public challenges, daring any local fighter brave enough to test their skill against his. It was a way to build a reputation. Win enough of these open duels and your name traveled with you. Benosuke, 13 years old, already trained by his father in the basics of the blade, already restless with that hunger we talked about, walked up to that notice and decided he was going to answer it. Close your eyes for a second and imagine you're standing where Benosuke stood. You are 13. You are not fully grown. You're still a kid, really, even if you don't feel like one. In your hands, you're not holding a sword. You're holding a long wooden staff because you don't own a proper blade yet. And honestly, you've never needed one before today. Across from you stands a grown man, an adult, a trained, experienced swordsman who has done this before, more than once, and won every time. He looks at you the way an adult looks at a kid who's wandered somewhere they shouldn't be, with a flicker of surprise, maybe even something close to pity. Your hands don't shake. That's the strange part. Somewhere deep in you, underneath the fear any sane person should feel in this moment, there's something colder and steadier. Focus. Not bravado. Focus. He draws his blade. The morning light catches the edge of it. You don't run. The duel begins, and it happens fast. Faster than you expected. Faster than these things are supposed to happen. You circle him. He lunges. And somewhere in that blur of motion, your staff connects, hard, and knocks his sword clean out of his grip. For one heartbeat, he's unarmed and stunned, staring at you with something between confusion and fear. You don't hesitate. You strike. Arima Kihei did not survive that strike. Benosuke, a boy of 13, had just killed a grown, trained swordsman, using nothing but a wooden staff. We need to sit with this for a moment rather than cheer it, because that's what the real Musashi eventually did too. This isn't a video game where a win is just a win. A person's life ended on that ground. Whatever else Musashi became later, a philosopher, a painter, a man who wrote about peace and self-mastery, this violent, complicated beginning was baked into him permanently. He spent the next 40 years of his life wrestling with exactly what a moment like that was worth and what it cost. According to Musashi's own later writings, this duel with Arima Kihei really was his first recorded fight to the death, meaning we're not relying only on legend here. Musashi himself, decades later, referenced this early duel in his own account of his life. Word of a 13-year-old who had beaten and killed a full-grown duelist spread through the region fast. Whatever quiet future his uncle Dorinbo had hoped for him, a life of temples, brushes, and meditation, that future was over. And Benosuke wasn't finished. 3 years later, he would kill again from his old life completely, discarding not just his childhood, but his own name. 7. The boy who buried his name. By the time he was 16, Benosuke had grown restless in an entirely new way. The temple's calm had held him for a while, but that hunger from before hadn't gone anywhere. It had only gotten louder. Around 1599, he fought and defeated another swordsman, a man named Tadashima Akiyama, somewhere in the northern Hyogo region. Details of this duel are thinner than the one with Arima Kihei. History hasn't preserved every conversation, every strike, but the outcome is clear enough. Benosuke won again, and once more, his opponent did not survive. Something shifted in him after that second duel. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 2 killings before he was even old enough to be considered a full adult. Maybe it was simply that he could no longer pretend his path led back to his uncle's quiet temple. Whatever the reason, Benosuke made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He left Dorinbo's home, and he stopped being Benosuke. In feudal Japan, a name wasn't just a label. It was tied to identity, family, and destiny. Discarding a childhood name and choosing a new one was a way of saying, I am someone different now. I am choosing who I become. He took the name of the village where he'd been born and combined it with a new personal name. He became Miyamoto Musashi. The characters that make up the name Musashi can be read in more than one way, and over the centuries, scholars have debated their exact meaning and origin. But what's certain is this. From this point forward in his life, this is the name history remembers him by. The name that would eventually mean something to millions of people who never met him, in a country he never left, and, centuries later, to people all over the entire world. He was 16 years old. He had already killed 2 men. He had no permanent home, no lord to serve, and no clear plan for what came next. And Japan itself was about to be thrown into the single most important battle of the entire century. A battle that would decide who ruled the whole country, and that Musashi's own life...
Here's where we need to be extra careful, because this is one of the moments in Musashi's story where the honest answer is, we don't fully know. In the year 1600, Japan's long power struggle came to a head at a place called Sekigahara, in a battle that historians consider one of the most decisive in the entire history of the country. On one side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, a powerful and patient warlord who had been building alliances for years. On the other side stood a coalition of daimyo loyal to the young heir of the previous ruler, led in the field by a general named Ishida Mitsunari. The battle lasted only a matter of hours, but its outcome reshaped Japan for the next 2.5 centuries. Tokugawa won decisively, and his victory led directly to the founding of the Tokugawa shogunate, a new, centralized government that would rule Japan in relative peace all the way until the 1860s. So where was 16-year-old Miyamoto Musashi during all of this? Later biographies, written well after Musashi's death, sometimes drawing on family traditions and sometimes drawing on plain old storytelling, claim that Musashi fought at Sekigahara on the losing side, alongside forces allied with Ishida Mitsunari, and that he survived the chaotic retreat afterward. Some of these accounts even suggest this defeat is what made him a ronin, a samurai without a lord to serve. But here's the honest, complicated truth. Modern historians simply aren't sure this is accurate. Solid contemporary evidence placing the teenage Musashi on that specific battlefield is thin. It's entirely possible that later storytellers, centuries after his death, folded him into history's most famous battle simply because it made for a better story. The kind of dramatic detail a legend tends to collect over time, the way a snowball picks up more snow the further it rolls. We're going to run into this problem more than once in Musashi's story, separating the documented man from the legend that grew up around him after he died. It doesn't make his real story less amazing. If anything, it makes it more remarkable, because the true version doesn't need any exaggeration to be extraordinary. What we do know for certain is this. By the early 1600s, the great civil wars of the Sengoku period were ending. Japan was entering an unfamiliar new era of peace under Tokugawa rule, and that peace created a strange, difficult problem for tens of thousands of samurai across the country, men trained their entire lives for war, who suddenly had no war left to fight. Musashi was one of them. Lordless, restless, and armed with nothing but his own skill, he made a decision that would define the next decade of his life. He decided to go looking for a fight, not just any fight, the biggest, most dangerous ones he could find, against the most respected swordsmen in the entire country. And the road he chose would lead him straight into the heart of Kyoto, and into a confrontation that would nearly wipe an entire fencing school off the map. There's a term for what Musashi did next, Musha Shugyo, which translates roughly to warrior pilgrimage. It was a tradition among ambitious samurai. A young fighter would leave home and travel the country for months or years at a time, deliberately seeking out skilled opponents in duels, sparring matches, and formal challenges, testing and refining his own technique against the best fighters he could find in each new province. Think of it almost like an athlete who spends years traveling from city to city, seeking out the toughest competition available, not for prize money, but purely to know, with total certainty, exactly how good they really are. Except in Musashi's case, many of these matches carried the very real risk of death. By his early 20s, Musashi had built himself into something rare. A fighter with no fixed address, no single teacher, and no master but his own relentless self-testing. He carried whatever swords he could, sometimes a proper katana, sometimes, as we've already seen, nothing more than a length of wood. And he went looking for the province of Japan, where the strongest swordsmen were said to live. That search led him to Kyoto, and in Kyoto, in the year 1604, at around the age of 20 or 21, Musashi set his sights on the single most respected fencing academy in the entire city. He was about to walk into a conflict with an entire school of trained swordsmen, a conflict that would leave two of its finest masters dead or ruined, and that would end, finally, not in an honorable duel, but in an ambush in the dark, against a boy barely older than Musashi had been when he killed his first opponent. The school Musashi challenged was run by the Yoshioka family, and in the early 1600s, their name meant something. For generations, the Yoshioka had served as official fencing instructors to the shoguns of the earlier Ashikaga era. Their academy in Kyoto trained hundreds of students. Beating a Yoshioka master wasn't just winning a duel, it was making a statement to the entire martial world of Japan. I am someone you need to know about. Musashi walked straight up to the head of that school and challenged him personally. His name was Yoshioka Seijuro. The duel was arranged with wooden practice swords, called bokken, solid, straight, unsharpened blades of oak, used so that training matches wouldn't turn into funerals. That was the idea, anyway. Musashi struck with such speed and force that he shattered Seijuro's arm and shoulder in a single blow. The wooden sword hadn't been sharp. It hadn't needed to be. Seijuro's dueling career ended on the spot. According to some traditions, the crippled swordmaster eventually gave up the way of the blade entirely and became a Buddhist monk, trading one discipline for another, the same way Musashi's own uncle once had. You might think that would settle things. It didn't. The Yoshioka name had just been humiliated in front of all of Kyoto, and the family's honor now fell to Seijuro's younger brother, a man named Yoshioka Denshichiro. He wasn't interested in forgiveness. He wanted revenge, and he challenged Musashi to a second duel. This time, Denshichiro came prepared for Musashi's speed and power. He armed himself with a heavy wooden staff reinforced with iron rings, a weapon built for reach and mass, designed to overwhelm a swordsman before he could get close enough to strike. It didn't work. Musashi defeated him too, reportedly killing him with a single powerful strike to the head. Two of Kyoto's finest swordsmen, one maimed, one dead, beaten by a lone traveler with no school, no lord, and no formal title. In the span of what may have been only a few weeks, Musashi had gutted the leadership of one of the most respected fencing academies in Japan. These duels weren't just about personal glory. In this era, a swordsman's entire livelihood, his students, his reputation, his family's income for generations, could rest on the outcome of a single match. When Musashi beat the Yoshioka's best fighters, he wasn't just winning a fight. He was quietly bankrupting a family business built over decades. The Yoshioka school was now in genuine crisis, its two best fighters gone, its reputation collapsing. Leadership fell to the only person left with any claim to the family name, Seijuro's own son, a boy named Yoshioka Matashichiro. He was 12 years old. The remaining Yoshioka students sent Musashi one final challenge, a duel against their new headmaster. On paper, it looked almost too easy, almost insulting, a grown, undefeated duelist against a 12-year-old boy. But Musashi had learned by now to trust his instincts over his eyes. Something about this challenge didn't sit right with him, and his instincts were correct. The meeting was arranged for a spot outside the city, near the Ichi-ryu temple grounds, under the shade of an old pine tree. This was never going to be a fair duel. It was an ambush. Dozens of Yoshioka students, armed with swords, spears, bows, and even a few early firearms, were hiding in the trees and undergrowth, waiting to surround and kill Musashi the moment the young headmaster drew him into the open. Musashi guessed the trap before it could close. He arrived earlier than expected, while it was still dark, and turned the ambush inside out. When the boy and his hidden army finally moved into position, Musashi was already there waiting. He struck down young Matashichiro in a single blow, and then the rest of the Yoshioka force attacked from every direction at once. In the chaos of shadows, torchlight, and steel, Musashi cut his way free and escaped into the darkness, leaving several of his attackers dead or dying behind him. We need to slow down here and actually sit with what this chapter of Musashi's life really is, because it is not a clean, satisfying victory. This wasn't a fair duel between equals proving their skill. Musashi killed a 12-year-old boy who had been placed, without any choice of his own, into a role he almost certainly didn't understand or want. Yes, it was an ambush. Yes, Musashi's own life was in real danger, surrounded by dozens of armed opponents, but the moral weight of that night doesn't disappear just because the tactics were justified. It's part of why, later in life, the real Musashi came to see his own violent youth with such complicated, uneasy honesty. Not pride exactly, but something heavier and more thoughtful. The Yoshioka school never fully recovered its former prestige after this confrontation. What had once been one of the most respected fencing academies in Japan faded from prominence within a generation. A stark reminder that reputation, once shattered, is one of the hardest things in the world to rebuild. By dawn, the once mighty Yoshioka school was finished, and Miyamoto Musashi, barely into his 20s, had become one of the most talked about swordsmen in the entire country. But fame wasn't what Musashi was chasing. He wanted to know exactly how far his skill could go, and that search would take him next to a quiet temple in the ancient city of Nara to test himself against something he had never faced before. Warrior monks, trained for generations in a weapon that could kill a swordsman before he ever got close enough to swing. Nara was one of Japan's oldest cities, a place of towering temples, quiet gardens, and centuries of Buddhist tradition. It was also home to the Hozoin Temple, whose monks had developed a fighting style built entirely around a single weapon. The spear. This might sound strange at first. Monks devoted to peace and meditation, also training for war. But in feudal Japan, many temples doubled as centers of martial training, especially in dangerous, unstable times. Discipline of the body and discipline of the mind were often seen as two halves of the same practice. A monk who could sit in perfect stillness for hours could also, if trained the right way, move with terrifying precision when a spear was in his hands. Musashi traveled to Nara specifically to test his sword against the Hozoin spearmen. A spear has an enormous advantage over a sword in reach. It can strike an opponent long before that opponent's blade is close enough to matter. Facing a trained spear fighter with nothing but a sword was by most measures a losing proposition. According to tradition, Musashi found a way anyway. He watched for the spearman's thrust, judged the timing, and closed the distance at exactly the right instant, turning the spear's greatest strength, its reach, into a weakness the moment the gap between them disappeared. Some versions of the story even claim he splintered the tip of his opponent's spear in the process. We should be honest that the precise details of Musashi's time at Hozoin come down to us mostly through tradition, rather than airtight documentation, the kind of story samurai told each other for generations afterward. But the core of it lines up with something we know for certain about Musashi. He deliberately sought out opponents using weapons completely different from his own, specifically because they were different. He wasn't just trying to win, he was trying to understand every kind of fight there was. This habit, hunting down unfamiliar styles just to learn from them, would define the rest of Musashi's fighting life. He wasn't interested in just being the strongest swordsman against other swordsmen. He wanted to understand combat itself, in every form it could take. And out of everything he had tested and survived by now, staffs, spears, ambushes, armored duelists twice his size, Musashi was quietly building something new. a fighting style nobody else in Japan was using, a style built around a single, deceptively simple idea. 2 swords at the same time, and it would make him almost impossible to fight. Here's a question worth sitting with for a second. Why did almost every samurai in Japan fight with a single sword held in both hands, when most of them also carried a second, shorter sword at their belt? The answer is simple: tradition and physics. A sword swung with both hands hits harder and controls better than a sword swung with one. Using 2 blades at once meant splitting your power, your balance, and your attention. Almost nobody thought it was worth the trade-off. Musashi disagreed, and by his mid to late 20s, after years of testing himself against every kind of opponent imaginable, he had built an entire fighting philosophy around exactly that disagreement. He called it Niten Ichi-ryu, which translates roughly to the school of 2 heavens as one. The idea was to wield the long sword, the katana, in one hand, and the shorter companion sword, the wakizashi, in the other, using both together at the same time for offense and defense in a single continuous motion. Think about what this actually meant in a real fight. Every other trained swordsman in Japan had spent their entire life learning to read a single blade, where it was going, how to defend against it. Musashi's opponents suddenly had to track 2 blades, moving independently, striking from 2 different angles at once. It wasn't just a new technique. It broke the fundamental rhythm his opponents had spent years training their bodies to expect. Musashi didn't invent this style overnight, and he didn't invent it out of nowhere either. Some accounts suggest his own father, Shinmen Munisai, had experimented with dual-weapon fighting using a sword and a jita together. Musashi took that same core idea and rebuilt it into something entirely his own. But Niten Ichi-ryu was never just a technique to Musashi, and this matters because it's the first real clue we get to the deeper thinker he would eventually become. He believed that true mastery wasn't about memorizing flashy moves. It was about understanding timing, distance, and your opponent's mind so completely that the right technique simply revealed itself in the moment. 2 swords weren't a trick. They were a physical expression of a much bigger idea that a truly free mind doesn't limit itself to only one way of doing things. By his late 20s, word of this style, and word of the man undefeated in every duel he'd ever fought, had spread across the country. Musashi claimed, later in his life, to have fought and won more than 60 life-or-death duels by this point. We should be honest here too. That number, 61 in the most common tradition, comes down to us mainly through Musashi's own account of his life, written decades later. We can't independently verify every single one of those encounters. But even his harshest critics, then and now, don't dispute that he was genuinely, remarkably good. Good enough that stronger and stronger opponents kept seeking him out, hoping to be the one who finally beat him. And in the western provinces of Japan, one such opponent had been quietly building his own fearsome reputation, a man some called simply the Demon. Musashi was about to meet him, and their meeting would become the single most famous sword duel in all of Japanese history. His name was Sasaki Kojiro, and by the time Musashi's reputation had spread far enough to reach him, Kojiro already had a fearsome one of his own. Kojiro fought with a weapon most swordsmen wouldn't even attempt to master, an unusually long, 2-handed blade called a nodachi, sometimes so long that people joked it looked more like a laundry pole than a sword. Where most warriors trained to fight at close range, Kojiro trained to control distance itself, using his blade's incredible reach to strike opponents before they could ever get close enough to touch him. And he had a signature technique, a move so fast and so precise that it became legendary all on its own. He called it Tsubame Geishi, the turning swallow cut. According to tradition, Kojiro developed the technique by watching swallows in flight, studying the impossibly quick way the birds could reverse direction mid-air. He built a sword strike that mimicked that same motion, a downward cut immediately followed by an upward one, so fast it seemed to defy the physical limits of a blade that long. People said the technique could strike a bird clean out of the sky. Kojiro earned the nickname Ganryu, meaning something like large rock style, after the fighting school he founded around this technique, and he became known across the western provinces as a demon of the sword, terrifying, unbeaten, and, by most accounts, more than a little arrogant about it. It's worth being honest about something here, too. Some modern historians have wondered whether Kojiro's reputation was somewhat inflated after his death, partly built up over time, specifically to make Musashi's eventual victory over him look even more impressive. We don't know for certain either way. What we do know is that by 1612, both men were widely regarded as two of the finest swordsmen in the entire country, and it was probably only a matter of time before someone arranged for them to meet. That someone was a regional lord named Hosokawa Tadaoki, under whose patronage Kojiro served as a swordmaster. Musashi, through an intermediary, requested a formal sanctioned duel, and Lord Hosokawa agreed, which gave the coming fight an official weight and legitimacy that most duels never had. The site chosen was a small, mostly unremarkable island off the coast, in a narrow strait called the Kanmon Strait. At the time, it was simply called Funashima. The date was set, April 13th, 1612. Neither man knew it yet, but by the end of that single morning, this quiet, forgettable little island would carry a brand new name for the rest of history. And it would not be named after the man who won. It's time to go back to the beach we started this whole story on. We opened this documentary on a small boat, crossing black water at dawn, with a man carving an oar into the shape of a sword. Now you know who he is. Now you know who's waiting for him on the shore. Let's finish the story properly. On the morning of April 13th, 1612, Sasaki Kojiro arrived at the appointed meeting place exactly on time, accompanied by witnesses sent to confirm the duel was conducted fairly. He waited, and waited. An hour passed, then more than one. Kojiro, young, proud, and already famous for his temper, grew more agitated with every passing minute. This was precisely the reaction Musashi wanted, because Musashi wasn't lost, and he wasn't afraid. He had deliberately arrived late, using the same psychological tactic he'd used years earlier against the Yoshioka, needling an opponent's composure before a single blow was ever struck. A calm mind fights better than an angry one. Musashi understood that as well as anyone in Japan, and he built his entire approach to this duel around making sure Kojiro's mind was anything but calm. At last, hours after the appointed time, a small boat appeared offshore. Musashi had used the crossing to carve one of the boat's spare oars into the rough shape of an oversized wooden sword, deliberately longer than Kojiro's already enormous nodachi, giving himself a reach advantage even without a blade of steel. Picture yourself as Kojiro for just a moment, standing on that beach. You've been waiting for hours. Your rage has had all morning to build into something white-hot. And when your opponent finally arrives, he doesn't even have a real sword. He's carrying a crude piece of carved wood, like this is some kind of joke to him, like you aren't worth the honor of steel. You draw your blade, and in a gesture meant to show you have no intention of ever needing to sheath it again, you throw your scabbard onto the sand. The man across from you looks at that discarded scabbard for a moment, and then, calmly, almost gently, he says something that lands harder than any blow could. If you have no use for your sheath, you've already lost. He's telling you that a warrior who throws away his own scabbard has already decided he isn't planning to survive the fight, that he's given up his own future the moment the sheath hit the ground. The duel began, and it was over in seconds. Kojiro struck first, unleashing his famous turning swallow cut with terrifying speed, so fast, so close, that the blade sliced clean through the cord, holding back Musashi's hair, sending it falling loose around his face. Some accounts say the strike even grazed his forehead. It was by any measure an extraordinary attack. It missed. In that same fraction of a second, Musashi swung his carved wooden blade, longer than Kojiro's sword, giving him just enough extra reach, and struck Kojiro directly in the skull. Sasaki Kojiro, the demon of the western provinces, fell to the sand. He did not get back up. The duel that history remembers as the single greatest sword fight in Japan's story had lasted only moments. No prolonged sword-clashing spectacle like you'd see in a movie, just one devastating strike from a man wielding a piece of wood against one of the finest blades in the country. In the aftermath, the little island of Funashima was given a new name in memory of the encounter. Ganryujima, Ganryu's Island, named directly after Sasaki Kojiro's fighting style. Sit with that for a second. The island wasn't renamed to celebrate the winner. It carries the name of the man who lost. a small, strange kindness history paid to the loser of its most famous duel, and a reminder that even legendary victories leave something behind worth mourning. Musashi walked away from that beach the undisputed greatest swordsman in Japan, and something in him had changed forever, because according to the historical record, Miyamoto Musashi never fought another lethal duel again for the rest of his life. At around 30 years old, having just achieved the single greatest victory of his career, he began, quietly, to wonder if winning fights was ever really the point at all. There's something worth noticing in what Musashi didn't do after Ganryujima. He didn't go looking for the next great rival. He didn't try to top the story he'd just written for himself. Something about standing over Kojiro's body on that beach seems to have quietly rearranged his priorities. We don't have Musashi's private diary from this exact moment. We can't climb inside his head and know precisely what he felt walking away from that island. But we do know the pattern of the rest of his life, and the pattern tells its own story. He kept sparring, he kept teaching, but the death matches, the duels where someone was expected not to walk away, simply stopped. In his own later writings, Musashi suggested that true mastery of the sword was never really about winning fights at all. It was about something quieter and much harder to achieve, a kind of clarity of mind, a discipline that had nothing left to prove to anyone. Here's a comparison worth thinking about. Imagine spending your entire childhood and teenage years chasing one single goal, being the best at something, proving it over and over, match after match, and then finally, undeniably, achieving it. What happens the day after that? For a lot of people, winning doesn't feel the way they expected it to. Something is supposed to click into place, some deep sense of "I've made it," and often it just doesn't come. Musashi was 30 years old, undefeated in over 60 life-or-death encounters, and instead of celebrating, he started asking harder questions. What is any of this actually for? After Ganryujima, Musashi entered what many historians consider the true turning point of his life. Not another duel, but a slow, decades-long shift from itinerant swordsman to something else entirely. A teacher, a builder, a father, and eventually a writer, trying to put everything he'd learned into words other people could actually use. Japan itself was changing right along with him. The wars were over. The Tokugawa shogunate had ushered in an era of long, stable peace, and a country full of warriors trained their whole lives for battle now had to figure out what a sword was worth in a world that no longer needed quite so many of them. Musashi was about to figure that out for himself, not on a battlefield and not in a duel, but in the unlikely setting of a castle garden, where the deadliest swordsman in Japan would discover something that made him, by his own account, happier than he had ever been in his life. Here's something almost nobody expects to hear about the greatest swordsman in Japanese history. Some of the happiest years of his life had nothing to do with a sword at all. In 1615, the last major war of Musashi's lifetime came to an end at the siege of Osaka Castle, where he may have served in a minor capacity supporting Tokugawa forces. With that, the age of large battles in Japan was well and truly over. And for a warrior in his early 30s who had already achieved everything a swordsman could achieve, a strange new question arrived. What do you do with the rest of your life? The answer, for a while, was construction. Musashi was invited into the service of a regional lord to help oversee a major building project, the construction of Akashi Castle and the planning of the surrounding town. This might sound like an odd assignment for a duelist. It wasn't. Japanese samurai were expected to be disciplined in far more than combat, and Musashi threw himself into this new work with the same relentless focus he'd once given to the sword. He didn't just supervise walls and fortifications. He was given charge of the castle's gardens, designing peaceful, deliberate landscapes with miniature mountains, a small ornamental lake, and a tea house, each stone and shrub placed with obsessive, painstaking care. Think about that contrast for a second. This is a man who once killed an opponent at 13 years old with a wooden staff, who cut his way out of an ambush by dozens of armed men, who split a rival's skull with a sword carved from a boat oar. And here he was, years later, spending entire afternoons deciding exactly where a single rock should sit beside a pond, because it mattered to him that it be right. That's not a contradiction. It's the same mind at work in a different setting. Musashi believed deeply that mastery of any one thing, the sword, a garden, a brush, a life, came from the exact same root. Total attention, total discipline, and total honesty about whether you'd actually done your best. By most accounts, the years Musashi spent working on Akashi Castle and its gardens were the happiest of his entire life. Here, at last, was a kind of peace he'd never quite managed to find on any battlefield or dueling ground, the quiet satisfaction of building something instead of ending it. It was during this settled, more stable period of his life that Musashi did something else he'd never done before. Having no wife and no children of his own, he formally adopted a young man to carry his name and his teachings forward. Musashi never married and never fathered any children of his own. Instead, throughout his life, he chose to adopt promising young men as sons, a practice that was fairly common among samurai of the era, and one that let him pass on his legacy to people he judged worthy of it, rather than leaving it to chance. His first adopted son was named Miyamoto Musashi. Musashi placed him in service with a regional lord's household, and for a while it looked as though the boy had a bright, stable future ahead of him. But that future came with a hidden condition, buried in the strict, unbending code samurai lived by, a condition that would soon cost Musashi something far more painful than any wound he'd taken in over 60 duels. Mikinosuke served in the household of a daimyo named Honda Tadatoki, and by all accounts he served well, earning trust, respect, and a genuine place within the Lord's inner circle. For a young man who had once been an orphan or castaway, taken in by Japan's most famous swordsman, this was everything a samurai's life was supposed to add up to: loyalty, purpose, belonging. In 1626, Lord Honda Tadatoki died. Under the strictest, oldest interpretation of samurai loyalty, some retainers believed that if their lord died, the truest expression of devotion was to follow him in death, a practice called junshi. It wasn't required by law. It wasn't even universally admired, even at the time, but it was considered, by those who chose it, the ultimate proof of a bond that outlasted life itself. Mikinosuke chose it. We're not going to describe the details of what happened next, because they don't need describing, and dwelling on them wouldn't teach you anything true about Musashi's life. What matters is the outcome, and what it cost the man who had raised him. Musashi had treated Mikinosuke as his own son in every way that counted. And now, that son was gone. Not in battle, not in a duel, but because of a code of loyalty so absolute it demanded a young man's entire future in exchange for honoring a debt to someone who could no longer even witness the gesture. There's a particular kind of grief in losing someone to an idea, to a rule, a code, an expectation, rather than to chance, or illness, or violence. It's the kind of loss that comes with an unanswerable question attached to it. Did it have to be this way? We don't have Musashi's private words about this moment. He wasn't the kind of man who wrote his grief down for others to read. But the silence itself tells us something. A man capable of walking away calmly from the corpse of the most feared swordsman in Japan was, underneath all of that composure, still someone who could be broken by the loss of a son. The practice of junshi became so controversial, and so many families lost promising young retainers to it, that the Tokugawa shogunate formally banned it decades later, in 1663, recognizing officially what many had quietly believed all along, that a code demanding a young life in tribute to a dead one had gone further than loyalty ever needed to go. Musashi didn't stop building a family, though, even after this loss. He had one more son still to raise, and this one would carry Musashi's name and his memory all the way to the very end. His second adopted son was named Miyamoto Iori, and where Mikinosuke's story had ended in tragedy, Iori's would stretch on for decades, carrying his father's legacy long after Musashi himself was gone. Iori grew into a capable, trusted administrator in his own right, eventually rising to a position of real authority in the service of the domain he served near Kokura in Kyushu. Musashi guided him not just in swordsmanship, but in the same broader discipline he'd come to believe in, the idea that a well-lived life required competence in far more than one skill. For most of his adult life, Musashi deliberately avoided accepting a fixed, permanent stipend from any single lord, the kind of guaranteed income most samurai spent their whole careers chasing. He preferred the freedom of an independent life, moving between patrons on his own terms, right up until his final years, when he finally accepted a permanent position in Kumamoto. Independence, for Musashi, wasn't just a preference. It was very nearly a philosophy. Iori would go on to outlive his adoptive father by decades, and in the years after Musashi's death, it was Iori who made sure the world remembered him properly, commissioning a stone memorial inscription in Kokura in 1654, 9 years after Musashi died, carefully recording his lineage and his life's achievements for anyone who might visit and wonder who this man really was. But before any of that, Musashi still had one more piece of warfare left in him. Not a duel this time, but a real brutal military campaign, fought not for glory, but because his lord's forces required his experience. He was in his 50s now, and the last battlefield of his life was waiting. Between 1637 and 1638, a massive uprising broke out in the Shimabara Peninsula of Kyushu, a rebellion led largely by Japanese Christians and masterless samurai, driven to revolt by crushing taxation and religious persecution under the shogunate. It became known as the Shimabara Rebellion, and it would turn into one of the bloodiest conflicts in the entire Tokugawa era. Musashi, now in his mid-50s, accompanied the forces of the Hosokawa clan, the same powerful family whose patronage would soon become the anchor of his final years, as they marched to help crush the revolt. He wasn't fighting on the front lines the way he had as a teenager. This was a different kind of warrior now, not a duelist proving himself blade to blade, but an experienced advisor, walking the siege lines around the rebels' final stronghold at Hara Castle, offering tactical guidance built on a lifetime of studying combat in every form it could take. Even so, war doesn't spare anyone completely, no matter how skilled or careful they are. During the campaign, Musashi was reportedly struck by a stone hurled from the castle's defenses, a humbling, almost undignified kind of injury for a man once considered untouchable in single combat. It's a strange, quiet detail worth sitting with. The greatest swordsman in Japan, brought briefly to the ground not by a rival's blade, but by a rock thrown by a defender he never even saw. There's something almost poetic in that moment if you think about it. A man who had spent his entire youth mastering the precise, controlled art of the duel, one opponent, one moment, one decisive strike, found out in his 50s that a real war doesn't play by a duelist's rules at all. Chaos doesn't care how many life-or-death matches you've won. The rebellion was finally crushed in 1638, and it marked the last serious armed conflict Musashi would ever take part in. From here forward, his story moves away from battlefields entirely, and towards something quieter, and in its own way, far more demanding. Because Musashi's final years weren't spent resting on his reputation. They were spent racing against his own failing body, trying to write down everything he had learned before it was too late. By the early 1630s, word of Musashi's reputation had reached one of the most powerful families in Kyushu, the Hosokawa clan, ruling from Kumamoto in Higo province. Their lord, Hosokawa Tadatoshi, invited Musashi to come live under his patronage. For the first time in his entire adult life, Musashi accepted something close to permanent stability. Around 1634, he moved to Kumamoto Castle as an honored guest, and by 1640 he was formally received as a retainer of the Hosokawa clan, granted a substantial stipend and a residence of his own. After decades of wandering, a lordless swordsman with no fixed home, testing himself against anyone willing to fight, Musashi finally had land, income, and standing. And he'd earned every bit of it purely through the weight of his own reputation, without a single drop of noble family blood behind him. These Kumamoto years were rich ones. Musashi taught students the discipline of Niten Ichi-ryu, not just the physical techniques of two-sword fighting, but the underlying mental calm and awareness he believed mattered even more than technique itself. He devoted serious time to painting, calligraphy, and even sculpture, carving wooden statues of Buddhist figures with the same bold, decisive confidence he'd once brought to a sword strike. Several of Musashi's ink paintings survive to this day and are treasured as genuine artistic achievements in their own right, not just historical curiosities from a famous swordsman's spare time. One of his most admired works, a monochrome ink painting known as Shrike Perched on a Dead Branch, shows a small bird sitting in perfect, watchful stillness, an image many later viewers have connected to the same alert calm Musashi valued in a warrior's mind. He wasn't just the greatest swordsman of his era, he was a genuinely gifted artist, working in a completely different medium with the exact same values, patience, decisiveness, and total honesty in every stroke. In 1641, at Lord Hosokawa's request, Musashi wrote a short document called the Hyoho Sanjugo Kajo, 35 articles on strategy, condensing decades of hard-won knowledge into a compact set of teachings. It was in many ways a rough draft for something much larger still forming in his mind. But by 1642, Musashi's health had begun to fail. He developed a painful nerve condition, and sensing, correctly, that his time was growing short, he made a decision that would define how the entire world remembers him today. In 1643, Musashi withdrew from the comfort of his Kumamoto residence and climbed into the hills outside the city to a quiet, remote cave called Reigando, the Spirit Rock Cave. There, alone, in near total silence, the aging master sat down to write. What emerged from that cave over the following 2 years would become one of the most studied books on strategy, discipline, and self-mastery ever written. A work still read today, nearly 400 years later, by soldiers, athletes, business leaders, and ordinary people simply trying to understand themselves a little better. Musashi titled his final great work Goren no Sho, the Book of Five Rings. Rather than write it as one continuous story, he organized it into 5 separate sections, each one named after a different element of the natural world: earth, water, fire, wind, and void. Let's actually go through what each one means, not as dusty old philosophy, but as ideas you could genuinely use in your own life, starting today. The Earth Scroll is about foundations. Before you can build anything worth having, a skill, a friendship, a good life, you need solid ground underneath it, the right attitude, real patience, and an honest understanding of your own starting point. Musashi believed you couldn't shortcut this part. You can't build a strong house on a foundation you never bothered to lay properly, and you can't build a strong life on habits and character you never bothered to develop. The Water Scroll is about adaptability. Water doesn't fight the shape of the container it's poured into. It simply becomes that shape, flowing around every obstacle without losing what makes it water in the first place. Musashi wanted his students to fight and to live the same way, flexible, responsive, never so rigid in their thinking that a surprise could break them completely. The Fire Scroll is about intensity, the heat of real engagement, whether that's a duel, a competition, or any moment that demands everything you've got. Musashi wrote about seizing the right moment fully, without hesitation, once you've decided to act. Half measures, in his experience, got people killed. In your own life, the stakes are usually much lower, but the lesson holds up anyway. Some moments call for your full commitment, not a hesitant, half-hearted effort. The Wind Scroll is about understanding other ways of doing things, studying other schools, other traditions, other people's approaches, precisely so you can recognize what's genuinely useful and what isn't, rather than blindly copying someone else's path. Musashi respected other techniques enough to study them seriously. He just never let them replace the trust he'd built in his own. The Void Scroll is the shortest, and in many ways the strangest. Void doesn't mean empty-headed or thoughtless. It means a mind so well-trained, so free of clutter and self-doubt, that the right action simply happens, without you needing to consciously calculate every step. Musashi believed this was the true peak of mastery in anything. Not overthinking, not underthinking, just clear, natural, honest action. In the introduction to the Book of Five Rings, Musashi openly admits that despite winning every single duel he ever fought, he didn't feel he'd truly grasped the deeper way of strategy until he was around 50 years old. Think about that. A man undefeated in over 60 life-or-death contests didn't consider himself a true master until decades after his last duel was won. For Musashi, mastery was never a finish line. It was a direction you kept walking in for as long as you were alive. But the Book of Five Rings wasn't the very last thing Musashi ever wrote. About a week before his death, with almost no strength left, he picked up his brush one final time to leave behind something shorter, sharper, and even more personal. Musashi called this final piece of writing the Dokodo, the way of walking alone. It's not a book. It's a single page, containing just 21 short precepts written for his most devoted student, a man named Terao Maganojo, who would carry both this document and the Book of Five Rings forward after Musashi's death. Let's look at 4 of the biggest ideas hidden inside those 21 lines. Because these aren't just old samurai rules. They're genuinely useful, even now, even for you. The first idea is honesty with yourself. One of the very first precepts Musashi wrote down reads, essentially, accept everything just the way it is. That sounds simple, but it's actually one of the hardest things a person can practice. It means facing reality clearly, your mistakes, your limits, your current situation, instead of pretending things are different than they are or wishing them away. Musashi believed clear thinking always starts with an honest look at what's actually true. The second idea is patience. Musashi wrote that we shouldn't let ourselves be ruled by regret and shouldn't chase pleasure just for its own sake. He wasn't telling people never to enjoy anything. He was pointing at something deeper, the patience to build towards something real and lasting, instead of constantly chasing quick, easy comfort that doesn't actually make you stronger. The third idea is self-reliance. Several precepts talk about being indifferent to where you live, not clinging to possessions, and having no fixed preferences that trap you in one way of doing things. Musashi spent almost his entire life without a permanent home, and he came to see that flexibility, the ability to stand steady no matter where he found himself, as a genuine strength, not a hardship. The fourth idea is not needing others' approval. Musashi wrote, think lightly of yourself and deeply of the world. That doesn't mean thinking you're worthless. It means not being ruled by how impressive you appear to other people, and instead paying real attention to the world and the people around you. And the very last precept of all, the 21st, sums up everything that came before it in just 4 words. Never stray from the way. Stay true to what you actually believe, even when, especially when, nobody's watching and nobody's applauding. Musashi wrote the Dokodo only about a week before his death, when he almost certainly knew the end was close. Think about what that means. Out of everything he could have spent his final days doing, he chose to leave behind in his own hand the clearest, most distilled version of everything he had learned about how to live, a kind of final gift, addressed not just to his one student, but, in a strange way, to anyone who would ever read it afterward, including you right now. Musashi had settled his affairs. He had finished his life's great written work, and now, in the spring of 1645, he was ready for what came next. In June of 1645, Musashi could feel that his time was nearly over. Some traditions suggest he was suffering from a serious illness, quite possibly a cancer of some kind, though we can't know for certain exactly what it was. What we do know, from the accounts left by those who were with him, is how he chose to meet it. On June 13th, 1645, Musashi did something almost startling for a man who had spent decades living a rough, wandering life. He took a bath. By some accounts, one of the only full baths he'd taken as an adult, and dressed himself carefully in his finest formal clothing. He didn't lie down. He had himself helped into a seated position, the formal posture of a warrior, one knee drawn up toward his chest. In one hand he held the hilt of his sword, in the other a cane. Surrounded by his students and the retainers of the Hosokawa household who had come to honor him, Miyamoto Musashi sat quietly, watching the world outside, and passed away. No dramatic last words, no final duel, just an old man, sitting upright, calm, at peace with a life that had begun in loss and violence, and ended somehow in stillness. By his own request, he was buried near Mount Iwato, close to the cave where he'd written his final teachings, dressed in his armor and weapons, as though, even in death, he remained ready for whatever came next. His story didn't end there, though. If anything, it was only just beginning, because the centuries after his death would turn Miyamoto Musashi into something far bigger than the man himself ever was. In the years and decades after Musashi's death, his reputation only grew, and it grew in more directions than just swordsmanship. His fighting style, Niten Ichi-ryu, was carried forward by his students, and remarkably, branches of that same two-sword tradition are still practiced in dojos across Japan today, nearly 400 years later. A direct, living thread connecting modern students back to techniques Musashi himself developed. But his legacy as an artist, deserves just as much attention as his legacy as a warrior. Musashi's surviving ink paintings and calligraphy are genuinely respected works of Japanese art, studied not as historical footnotes, but as real artistic achievements. He was, in the truest sense, both things at once, a master of the sword and a master of the brush, living out a philosophy he believed in completely, that discipline, honesty, and total attention could turn any pursuit into a path toward mastery. Musashi's fame kept growing for centuries after his death, through plays, woodblock prints, and folk stories, until in 1935, a novelist named Eiji Yoshikawa began publishing a heavily fictionalized version of his life story in a Tokyo newspaper. That novel became enormously popular and shaped how millions of people in Japan and around the world picture Musashi even today. But it's important to know the difference between the two. Yoshikawa's Musashi is a novel, a beautiful, dramatic story, but a story all the same, complete with invented characters and entirely fictional scenes. One especially famous episode from that novel, a young Musashi supposedly being tied to a tree by a wise monk named Takuan Soho to teach him a lesson in discipline, never actually happened. It's a beloved piece of 20th century fiction, not a historical event. However, often it gets retold as though it were fact. The real, documented Musashi doesn't need any of that invented drama to be remarkable. A boy who killed his first opponent at 13, who tore apart one of Japan's most prestigious fencing schools by his early 20s, who won the single most legendary duel in the country's history using a sword he carved from a boat oar, and who spent his final years writing a book still studied by soldiers and business leaders across the entire world. That's already one of the most extraordinary true stories in all of Japanese history. It doesn't need embellishing, it just needs telling, honestly. Today, sites connected to Musashi's life, the cave at Reigando, the island of Ganryujima, his memorial grounds near Kumamoto, remain places people travel to visit, centuries after his death, to stand somewhere he once stood and feel, if only for a moment, some small connection to a man who spent his entire life trying to master himself. So let's go back, one final time, to that beach at dawn, the man in the boat, carving an oar into a sword, rowing toward a fight that would make him the most famous swordsman in Japanese history. It's tempting to think that moment is the whole story, the dramatic duel, the impossible victory, the legendary reputation. It's the part everyone remembers first. And it's a genuinely extraordinary thing that happened. But it isn't really the ending of Musashi's story, is it? The ending is an old man, sick and worn down, sitting alone in a cave, spending the very last of his strength not on another fight, but on writing down everything he'd learned. Patience, honesty, self-reliance, the courage to walk your own path even when it's lonely, so that people who would never even meet him might live a little better because of it. Musashi wasn't remembered for 61 duels, because winning fights was ever really the point. He was remembered because underneath all that violence and skill was a boy who never stopped asking one honest question, his whole life long. What does it actually mean to live well? You don't need to master a sword to learn something real from that question. You don't need 61 duels, or a cave, or a legendary rival waiting for you on a beach at dawn. You just need the same things Musashi eventually figured out, the hard way, over an entire lifetime. Patience with yourself while you're still learning. Honesty about where you actually stand, right now, today. The confidence to walk your own path, even when it's the harder one, even when no one's clapping for you along the way. That was Musashi's real victory, not the duels. Making peace at the very end with the boy he'd once been. The one who lost his mother the day he was born, who never quite found the approval he was looking for, and who spent 40 years turning all of that pain into something worth leaving behind. Somewhere in your own life, right now, there's probably a version of that same question waiting for you. You don't have to answer it today. Musashi didn't either, not until he was almost 60 years old, sitting alone in a quiet cave, finally at peace. But it's worth asking anyway.